I want you to picture a mirror.
Okay, a mirror.
Yeah. It's hanging in a hallway in, well, let's say Vienna or London, right around the year 1850.
Got the picture.
You walk past it, and the reflection is crisp, perfect lighting. You see yourself, you see the furniture behind you, maybe the garden out the window. Everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. It makes sense? It's a very comfortable image.
Right, it's the image of a world that feels solvable.
Yeah.
You know, everything is in its place and accounted for.
Precisely. But now, I want you to keep walking down that hallway. 50 years pass. You come back to that exact same mirror around 1910, and someone has taken a sledgehammer to it.
Just completely smashed it.
The glass is shattered. The reflection is jagged, distorted. You look into it. You can't tell if that's your face or just a trick of the light. You really don't know what's real anymore.
And that visual metaphor is really the roadmap for today's deep dive.
It is.
We're tracking a massive psychological and intellectual breakdown in Europe, specifically between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914.
We're calling this deep dive the Shattered Mirror because it's the story of how Europe went from being absolutely certain it had the universe figured out,
Like a perfect clockwork machine.
exactly, to realizing it didn't even know how to tell time. We're moving from a world of positivism to a world of modernism, which is just a fancy academic way of saying anxiety and confusion.
It's a major shift, going from believing we have all the answers to realizing we might not even know the right questions. And what's fascinating is that this wasn't just some abstract debate in a dusty university library.
Right.
This crisis of confidence is what actually set the stage for the chaos of the 20th century.
So to guide you through this, we've got a massive stack of notes and sources here. We're looking at historical overviews, philosophy tracks, early psychological papers, and even breakthrough physics journals from the era.
Basically the greatest hits of existential dread.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. And our mission today is to distill what these sources are telling us about this monumental shift. Now, just a quick heads up for you listening. Our sources today touch on some pretty charged political and religious themes.
Very charged.
So we want to make it absolutely clear up front. We aren't taking any sides or endorsing any of these philosophies. We are strictly here to impartially report on what the source texts say to help you understand the historical mindset.
Absolutely. We're just the messengers charting the history of these ideas.
So before we get to the shattered part, we need to understand what the mirror looked like when it was whole. We need to talk about the comfortable era.
Right. If you look at the period between 1815 and roughly 1870, the dominant intellectual mood across our sources is something called positivism. And honestly, it's hard for us to imagine today just how confident these people were.
I mean, positivism sounds, well, it sounds positive. It sounds like a self-help book.
Stay positive, right. In a way, it was the ultimate self-help philosophy for humanity. The core idea in all the literature of the time was that science and mathematics were the absolute only paths to truth, with a capital T.
If you couldn't measure it, weigh it, or put it in a formula, it literally didn't exist to them. It wasn't worth talking about.
Exactly. No room for vibes, no room for intuition, just cold, hard data.
And the texts break this down into three main pillars. First is scientific validity. Knowledge is only true if it's verified by observation.
Right. And the second is rational analysis. They believed you had to use empirical observation to understand literally everything, not just chemistry or physics, but human society too.
And the third one, and this is really the big one, is universal progress.
Oh, the optimism of the 19th century.
It was the Star Trek part of the deep dive. There was this genuine, unshakable belief that because we were discovering these scientific laws, humanity was on an unstoppable upward escalator.
We figured out how heat works, how germs work, how electricity works. So naturally, the thought was, we will eventually solve poverty. We will engineer the perfect society.
It really ties into that concept of the clockwork universe. The texts point back to Isaac Newton here, because if the universe is just a big machine and we figure out all the gears and cogs, we can predict everything.
And that feels so incredibly safe. Newton had given them a universe that followed immutable laws. If you knew the position and speed of every particle, you could, theoretically at least, predict the future. No surprises.
But if you're living in a world where the rule is only what I can measure is true, you are eventually going to crash headfirst into religion.
Because you can't put a miracle in a test tube.
Exactly. And that's where the friction started in the primary sources. Traditional Christianity relies on divine revelation, the idea that truth comes from outside the system. From God, through the Bible.
But positivism said no, truth comes from inside the system, strictly through human observation.
There's a really specific example in the source material that I found super helpful. It talks about a single drop of blood.
Oh, that's a perfect encapsulation of the conflict.
Right, because if you are a religious believer in the mid-19th century, that drop of blood has massive metaphysical weight. You might think of the blood of atonement or the biblical idea that life is in the blood. These are huge spiritual concepts.
But if a positivist scientist puts that exact same drop of blood under a microscope, what do they see?
They see red blood cells, they see platelets, plasma.
Biology. They do not see sin, and they do not see redemption.
And here's the turning point. Because the microscope was so wildly successful at curing diseases and explaining the physical body, people started to trust the microscope more than the pulpit.
It's not that everyone became an atheist overnight. That's a misconception. But the cultural authority shifted.
The priest used to be the guy who explained how the world worked. Now it's the guy in the lab coat.
The objective proof for religious truth was vanishing from the public sphere. So by 1870, you have a society that feels very secure. Science is king, we're marching toward utopia, and the universe is a predictable machine.
And then the vibe shifts. The cracks start to show in the mirror.
We enter the era the sources call irrationalism.
Which, sounds a bit like a toddler's tantrum. But our sources show it's actually a very sophisticated philosophical breakdown.
It was a massive reaction against that cold, syllogistic reasoning of the Enlightenment. Thinkers started to look around at this clockwork society and say, wait a minute, humans aren't logic machines.
We don't act rationally most of the time.
Exactly. We are messy, emotional creatures driven by deep instincts.
And this brings us to the man who basically kicked the door down on this whole idea, Friedrich Nietzsche.
You really cannot tell the story of this era without him. He is the absolute poster boy for irrationalism.
He looked at this polite, hyper-scientific European society and said, "You are stifling yourselves." He argued that reason is actually secondary. The real driver of humanity, according to his texts, was passion, instinct, and what he called the will to power.
So let's unpack his most famous line, because everyone knows it, everyone quotes it, and it's almost always misunderstood. God is dead.
Yeah, people usually treat it as a catchy slogan for atheism. But reading the sources, Nietzsche was doing something much deeper. He was acting more like a cultural doctor.
He wasn't just stating his personal theological belief, he was diagnosing Europe.
He was saying that in this modern scientific industrial world, the Christian moral ethic that had held Europe together for 1,000 years was no longer the driving force. It has lost its power to unify.
Science killed the objective standard for truth. We essentially killed him with our microscopes.
And just remaining impartial reporters of the text here, Nietzsche was asking a terrifying societal question. What happens now? If God is dead in the cultural sense, we have lost our compass, we've wiped out the horizon.
Which sounds like a total nightmare. But Nietzsche seemed to think it was an opportunity, at least for a select few.
Right, for the extraordinary individual. He believed this cleared the way for the Superman, or Übermensch, to create their own values. But the sources show that for society at large, this leads to a very dangerous place. Relativism.
Relativism is the idea that there is no single truth with a capital T anymore. There's just your truth and my truth.
I always think of that old parable of the blind man and the elephant. One holds the trunk and says, it's a snake. Another holds the leg and says, no, it's a tree.
And in a relativistic world, they are both right from their own perspective. There is no objective observer standing back to say, actually, guys, it is an elephant.
That is deeply unsettling when you apply it to morality or politics. Because if I think a policy is good and you think it's evil and there's no universal referee anymore, how do we resolve it?
We just have to fight it out.
And that's exactly where the political danger comes in. Nietzsche wasn't the only one pushing this anti-rational wave. The sources bring up other figures, like Henri Bergson and Georges Sorel.
Let's touch on Bergson first. He argued that science is great for practical things, like building bridges or curing diseases. But if you want to understand actual reality, you need intuition.
Science is just surface level for him.
Exactly. But Sorel is where it gets really intense. He took this idea of irrationalism and totally weaponized it for politics.
Sorel is fascinating because, reading his stuff, he seems to just hate talking. He hated the idea of sitting in a parliament and debating policy.
He absolutely despised rational debate. He thought it was weak and bourgeois. He believed that true societal change didn't come from logic or voting. It came from myth.
He specifically pushed the myth of the general strike, The idea of a big, violent, revolutionary event that would completely energize the working class.
He was essentially saying, don't think, act. Violence becomes a cleansing force for him.
Again, we are definitely not endorsing Sorel's views on violence here. But historically, you can see the massive shift our sources are pointing out. We went from, let's analyze this with data in the positivist era, to let's fight it out because my will is stronger than yours.
Society was rapidly moving from a model of consensus to a model of conflict.
Okay, so the philosophy of the time is getting much darker. We've lost objective truth. But I imagine the average person walking down the street in 1890 was thinking, well, the philosophers in the universities are crazy, but at least I am rational. I know why I do things. I'm in control of my own life.
And that is exactly where Sigmund Freud comes in to shatter the mirror completely.
Freud really feels like the moment where the rational man ideal just packs its bags and leaves the building entirely.
It's the final insult to human pride. Before Freud, the assumption was that, sure, we might get emotional sometimes, but we ultimately sit in the driver's seat of our own minds. We are the captains of our own ships.
And Freud comes along and says, actually, you're not the captain. You're not even on the bridge. You're locked in the lower decks, and something else is steering the ship.
The unconscious.
He mapped the human mind as this dark reservoir of repressed trauma, instinctive desires, and aggressive drives, what he called the id.
It's actually disturbingly similar to how we talk about computer algorithms today.
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, we don't really know why a social media algorithm shows us what it shows. It's a black box. Freud was basically saying our own brains are black boxes to us.
Right. Our conscious behavior, the polite things we say and do on the surface, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The massive, dangerous part is completely underwater.
And here's the terrifying kicker in Freud's work. He suggested we are driven by forces we didn't choose and don't even understand.
That completely destroys the idea of objective self-knowledge. If I ask you, why did you choose that career? Why did you vote for that candidate? And you give me a perfectly logical reason.
Freud would say, that's just a rationalization. You're making up a logical story to cover up the real reason, which is buried deep in your subconscious.
So let's recap the damage to the mirror so far. We can't trust the world's morality because of relativism. We can't trust politics because it's driven by myth and violence. And now we can't even trust our own thoughts.
It's a psychological horror story for the Enlightenment thinker. And you start to see this bleed heavily into art and culture.
You get surrealism, stream of consciousness writing. Everything becomes very interior and confusing.
Because the artists were trying to express this new fractured reality. The world wasn't a neat photograph anymore. It was a fever dream.
And there's a big, here in the historical timeline, even if philosophy is dead and our minds are a mess, people thought they still had physics. Good old, reliable Newtonian physics.
Right.
If I drop an apple, it falls. The planets move in predictable ellipses. The physical universe is still a reliable machine. That had to be the one thing people could cling to.
It was the absolute last security blanket. For 200 years, Newtonian physics was the bedrock of certainty. It promised that the universe was stable, predictable, and totally distinct from our messy human lives.
And then two guys named Max Planck and Albert Einstein walked into the room and broke the clock entirely.
This is the physics revolution. And honestly, it's the climax of this whole intellectual breakdown.
Let's start with Planck, right around the year 1900.
So Planck is studying radiation, heat, and light. And he discovers something in the math that shouldn't be possible according to classical physics.
The quanta.
Exactly. He found that energy doesn't flow in a smooth, continuous stream, like water flowing from a hose. Instead, it comes in erratic, jerky little packets. He called them quanta.
Okay, but for you listening, why does jerky energy matter to a historian or a philosopher?
Because it killed causality at the subatomic level. In Newton's world, nature is smooth. A leads to B, which leads to C. But in the quantum world, nature jumps.
An electron is here, and then suddenly it's there, without traversing the space in between.
Right, so at the most fundamental, microscopic level of reality, the universe isn't a ticking clock, it's a casino. It's random and erratic.
It's chaotic, and that is terrifying if you've built your entire civilization's worldview on order and predictability.
But then Albert Einstein comes along in 1905 with the theory of relativity to finish the job Planck started.
The big one, E equals mc squared. But the sources don't dwell on the math, they dwell on the philosophical impact. What did this do to the idea of the universe?
Einstein proposed that space and time are not absolute containers. In Newton's world, a second is a second, and a meter is a meter, no matter where you are or what you're doing. It was the God's eye view of the universe.
And Einstein says no.
He proves that time slows down or speeds up depending on how fast you're moving relative to something else. Space bends.
Which means there is no fixed framework for reality.
There is no God's eye view anymore. There's only the observer. Two different people can witness the exact same event, record different times and different lengths, and mathematically they are both correct.
Wow. That is the physical proof of what Nietzsche was saying philosophically with the elephant analogy. Reality literally depends on where you are standing.
That's exactly why the cultural impact was so devastating. If the physical laws of the universe are relative, if the very foundation of space and time shifts depending on the observer, then the age of progress was built on quicksand.
It's a complete collapse of objective truth. We went from the microscope proving the ultimate truth to the microscope revealing ultimate chaos.
We call it the physics revolution. But as our sources show, it was a philosophical earthquake. It confirmed that the universe is complex, relative, and deeply uncertain.
So let's try to pull these shattered pieces of the mirror together, because we've covered a lot of ground today. We started in 1815 with positivism.
Objectivity, progress, clarity, the unshakable belief that we were mastering the world through reason.
And by 1914, we have modernism, relativism, uncertainty, complexity. In the span of a century, we dismantled religion, we dismantled the rational mind, and we dismantled the predictable universe.
And here's the thing that makes this deep dive so historically vital. This wasn't just happening in the ivory towers. This internal intellectual anxiety was mirroring the external real world perfectly.
Right, because look at the map of Europe during this exact same time. You had rising industrial poverty that all that science hadn't fixed. You had massive class conflict. You had incredibly aggressive militaristic nationalism.
It's like the collective mind of Europe was having a nervous breakdown, just as the countries were arming themselves with dreadnoughts and artillery.
The stranger in the mirror, that irrational, violent subconscious Freud talked about, was manifesting in actual national politics.
And the rejection of rational debate that Sorel advocated was playing out in international diplomacy.
So Europe enters the 20th century looking incredibly strong on the outside. They have electricity, global telegraphs, steamships, machine guns. They look like peak civilization.
Technologically, they were absolute giants. But intellectually and spiritually, they were completely unmoored. They had lost their guardrails.
They stripped away every single mechanism they had for making sense of the world right before they plunged into the most senseless conflict in human history.
World War I.
Exactly. The sources really paint the picture that the age of anxiety didn't start with the war. The war was, in many ways, the physical manifestation of this ongoing intellectual crisis. The mirror shattered long before the first shot was fired in 1914.
That is heavy. But it explains so much about the art and literature of the 1920s that followed. The wasteland motifs, the fragmentation in poetry. It wasn't just physical PTSD from the trenches. It was a fundamental, permanent loss of belief in universal order.
And that really is the definition of modernism. It's the desperate attempt to build something new out of the jagged shards of that mirror.
So, what's the big takeaway from all these sources? Why does this historical shift matter to you listening to this on your commute today?
I think the most provocative thought to leave you with is a reversal of how we normally view progress. We usually think of science and philosophy as tools that bring order. We think they clear up the confusion, like turning on a light in a dark room.
Right. Science explains the lightning, so we don't have to be terrified of the thunder god anymore.
But in this specific era, science and philosophy actually did the exact opposite. They removed order. They took away the security blanket of a predictable universe and a rational mind, right when the geopolitical world was becoming its most dangerous.
It's a stark reminder that progress isn't always a straight line toward clarity. Sometimes discovering more about reality just makes things far more complicated and terrifying.
And if you look around the world today, I think you can spot those exact same patterns. We have incredible technology, artificial intelligence, global connectivity, but do we feel more certain about what is true? Or do we feel more overwhelmed by relativism and conflicting narratives?
The shattered mirror is still very much hanging in our hallway.
It really is. We are still living in the reflection of that crisis.
We haven't put it back together yet.
On that cheery note, thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the chaotic, irrational, and totally fascinating mind of 19th century Europe. It's been a wild ride.
It always is.
We'll see you next time.